My dad's new wife took everything from me. My room, my car, even my father. I thought it couldn't get worse. I was wrong. Then she went even further, and no one stopped her. I used to think my dad and I were close. It was always just the two of us after my mom passed away when I was 8. He worked hard, made sure I had everything I needed, and even if he wasn't the most expressive guy, I knew he cared. Then, when I was 15, he met her. At first, I didn't think much of it. He deserved to be happy, and she seemed nice enough. She would bring over homemade cookies, ask about my schoolwork, and always made a big deal about how lucky she was to be in our lives. I thought maybe things would be okay. But little by little, things changed. It started with small things that felt insignificant at first. She would make little comments, mostly about her son, Jared, who was a year younger than me. Jared is so responsible, she'd say. He always helps out around the house. Or, Jared is just such a great kid, so mature for his age. At first, I thought she was just a proud mom. But then the comparison started. I wish you were more like Jared, she told me once when I forgot to do the dishes. He never needs to be asked twice. He's just got such a friendly personality, she'd say at dinner while I ate in silence. It's no wonder people are drawn to him. It stung, but I figured it was just talk. I could ignore it. Then came the bigger things. One day, completely out of the blue, my dad told me I'd have to switch bedrooms. We lived in a 3-bedroom house, his room, my room, and the smaller guest room. When Jared and his mom moved in, I figured he'd take the guest room. It only made sense. But no, my stepmother insisted Jared should have my room. It's only fair, she told me. Jared is used to a bigger space, and he has more stuff. I fought it. I pleaded with my dad, but he just sighed and said, it's not a big deal. We all have to make adjustments. So I got moved into the cramped guest room while Jared spread his things out in my space. And that was just the beginning. Losing my room was bad enough, but it didn't stop there. It was like I was being slowly erased from my own home. Jared got my old room, and suddenly, my things didn't fit in the house anymore. My bookshelves were too cluttered, my posters were too childish, and my dad agreed that maybe it was time to grow up and simplify. My stepmother took it upon herself to declutter my things one day while I was at school. Half my stuff was packed away in the attic, and some of it was just gone. When I asked about it, she smiled sweetly and said, "Oh, I donated what you didn't need. You'll thank me later." She didn't touch Jared's stuff. His things filled the house, his trophies displayed on the shelves, his posters framed on the walls, his school projects hung on the fridge. My things disappearing by the day. Then came the gifts. For my birthday that year, my dad got me a sweater. Just a plain, gray sweater. No card, no cake, no real celebration. Just a happy birthday, kid, and a sweater. Jared, meanwhile, got a brand new gaming console for his birthday. A big dinner. A cake with his name written in bright, bold letters. When I asked why, my stepmother laughed and said, "Well, you know, Jared's been so responsible lately, and we wanted to reward him." I wanted to scream. But the final straw, the thing that really made me realize just how little I mattered in my own home, was the car. When I turned 16, my dad gave me his old car. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and it was freedom. I loved that car. A year later, when Jared turned 16, my stepmother started hinting that he needed a car, too. "We can't expect him to just walk everywhere," she said. "He's got so many activities, so many friends. He needs transportation." I didn't think much of it. I assumed my dad would just get Jared a cheap used car or something. But then, one night at dinner, my dad dropped the bombshell. "Jared's going to be using your car from now on," he said, like it was nothing. I froze. "What?" "Well," my stepmother cut in, "it makes more sense, doesn't it? Jared needs it more. You don't drive that much anyway." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My car, the one I had taken care of, the one I had saved up money to maintain, was just being given to Jared. And my dad just sat there and let it happen. Losing the car was the moment I knew things would never go back to normal. Every time I saw Jared driving it, picking up his friends, blasting music like it had always been his, something inside me hardened. My dad didn't care. My stepmother certainly didn't. I was just supposed to accept it, like I had accepted everything else. At school, I tried to ignore the anger bubbling under the surface. It wasn't just about the car. It was about everything leading up to this. The bedroom, the gifts, the constant reminders that I wasn't as important as Jared. I started staying out later, finding any excuse not to go home. The library became my escape, the only place where I still felt like I had control over my own life. Home didn't feel like home anymore. Jared had the big room, the car, the attention. I had nothing but silence. At dinner, they barely spoke to me. My stepmother and Jared filled the conversation with inside jokes and updates about his day. My dad listened and nodded along. I ate quickly, keeping my head down, waiting for it to be over. It wasn't just indifference, it was something worse. It was like I was a guest in my own house, an afterthought in my own family. They weren't just ignoring me, they were replacing me. One night, while getting water from the kitchen, I overheard them talking. My stepmother said I was ungrateful, that after everything they had done for me, I still acted distant. My dad sighed, agreeing with her. Then she mentioned that maybe it was time for me to move out, that Jared would be going to college soon and they needed the space. I felt my whole body go cold. I had always known she didn't want me there, but hearing my dad agree made something inside me snap. I went back upstairs without making a sound, my heart pounding in my chest. They weren't even waiting for me to graduate. They were already planning for a future where I didn't exist in their lives. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't wait for them to push me out. I would leave on my own terms. From that night on, I stopped seeing the house as my home. It was just a place where I slept, a place I was slowly being phased out of. My stepmother had one. She had turned my own father against me, made Jared the center of his world, and now, she was making sure I didn't have a future there. I kept to myself more than ever, avoiding conversations, moving like a ghost through the house. If they wanted to act like I didn't exist, I would make it easy for them. I spent most of my time at school or the library, only coming home when I had no other choice. Jared, of course, didn't notice or didn't care. He was too busy enjoying his new life. The car, the attention, the effortless way he fit into the family dynamic while I faded into the background. He had taken everything, and he didn't even have to fight for it. My father, the man who had once been my biggest protector, barely acknowledged me. The rare times we were alone together, he seemed uncomfortable, like he didn't know what to say. Maybe he felt guilty. Maybe he didn't. Either way, he did nothing. The final shift happened on a random afternoon when I came home early from school. I walked into the kitchen and saw my stepmother and Jared sitting at the table, going over college applications. My father was there too, nodding along, fully engaged. Jared was looking at schools across the country, big, expensive universities, all of which would require financial support. My stepmother was already talking about scholarships and financial aid, but then she mentioned my college fund. That was when I realized. My dad had started saving for my college years ago. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was supposed to be mine. But now, my stepmother was talking about it like it belonged to Jared. They hadn't even told me. I stood there for a moment, listening, waiting to hear my father object, waiting for him to say that the money wasn't meant for Jared, that it was for me. But he didn't. That was all I needed to hear. I turned around and left before they noticed me. That night, I started making plans. I didn't care how difficult it would be. I refused to let them take anything else from me. I was done waiting for them to push me out. I was leaving, and I wasn't coming back. That night, I sat in my room, staring at the walls, thinking about everything they had taken from me. My room, my car, my place in the family, and now even my future. My stepmother had ensured that I was nothing more than an afterthought, and my dad had let it happen. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, my stomach twisting with anger and frustration. I thought about confronting them, demanding answers, but what would be the point? My dad wouldn't fight for me. He never had. Instead, I started planning my way out. I didn't have much money, but I had a part-time job at a local grocery store, enough to save a little each paycheck. I started cutting back on everything, no more eating out, no unnecessary spending. Every dollar I made went into a hidden envelope in the back of my closet. I even took on extra shifts whenever I could, staying out late to avoid being home. I also started looking at alternative options for college. I had good grades, and I knew I could apply for scholarships. I spent hours at the library researching schools, finding ones with financial aid programs that might help me. If they were going to steal my college fund for Jared, then I would find my own way. At home, I became invisible. I moved through the house silently, eating quickly, avoiding them as much as possible. If they noticed, they didn't care. My stepmother probably saw it as a victory. Jared had everything now. Why would he bother thinking about me? The only one who seemed to notice something was off was my dad. Every now and then, he would give me a strange look, like he was trying to figure out what was going on. Once or twice, he even opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but then he never did. He would sigh and turn back to whatever he was doing. That told me everything I needed to know. Then, one afternoon, something happened that solidified my decision to leave. I was in my room when I overheard Jared bragging to one of his friends on the phone. He was laughing, talking about the new gaming setup he wanted, casually mentioning that Dad's gonna cover college, so it's not like I have to save up or anything. It hit me like a punch to the gut. They had already decided. Later that night, I sat at the dinner table, watching the three of them talk and laugh like they were the perfect little family. My dad looked happy. My stepmother looked satisfied. Jared was glowing with confidence. None of them even looked in my direction. I realized then that I wasn't part of this family anymore. Maybe I never really had been, at least not since she moved in. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't just leaving. I was cutting them off for good. Once I made up my mind to leave, everything became clearer. I stopped expecting things to change, stopped hoping for some moment where my dad would wake up and see what was happening. I focused on what I needed to do. I started packing little by little, taking things out of my room in a way that wouldn't raise suspicion. I donated old clothes I didn't need, threw away anything unnecessary. The rest, I packed into a couple of suitcases and a backpack. I wasn't planning on telling them. They didn't deserve a goodbye. The hardest part was figuring out where to go. I had a couple of friends who knew things weren't great at home, but none of them had a place for me to stay long-term. I considered renting a cheap room somewhere, but with the money I had, I wouldn't last long. Then, I remembered my mom's sister, my aunt. We weren't close, mostly because my dad had drifted from her side of the family after my mom passed. But I had her number saved, and I knew she still lived a few hours away. Calling her felt like a risk, but I had no other options. When she picked up, I expected awkwardness, maybe even hesitation. Instead, the moment I told her who it was, she sounded surprised, then worried. She asked how I was, how my dad was treating me, and I could hear the concern in her voice. I hadn't planned on spilling everything, but once I started talking, it all poured out. I told her about the room, the car, the college fund, how I felt like a stranger in my own home. When I finally stopped, there was a long silence. Then, she said something I hadn't heard in a long time. You don't have to stay there. You can come live with me. I felt something tighten in my chest. I hadn't let myself hope for something like that. Not really. I had been ready to sleep on a friend's couch, scrape by, figure it out on my own. The idea that someone actually wanted me, that I had a way out that wasn't just surviving day by day, hit me harder than I expected. She gave me her address, told me she'd come get me if I needed. But I wasn't waiting. I told her I'd take the bus. That night, I made one last withdrawal from my savings. Enough for a bus ticket, enough to get far away from them. I went to bed that night knowing it would be my last in that house. I didn't feel sad. I just felt free. I woke up before dawn, my heart pounding in my chest. My bags were already packed, tucked into my closet so no one would notice. I moved quietly, making sure not to wake anyone as I grabbed the last few things I needed. There was no point in leaving a note. They wouldn't care why I left. As I slipped out of the house, I took one last look around. The walls that used to hold my childhood drawings now displayed Jared's trophies. The living room, where my dad and I used to watch movies, felt like a stranger's home. Even the kitchen smelled different, like the scent of my stepmother's expensive candles had erased any trace of the life I once had here. I turned away and walked out the door, not bothering to lock it behind me. The bus station wasn't far, just a short walk through the cold morning air. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. This was it. I was finally leaving. When I got to the station, I bought a one-way ticket to my aunt's city. It was a long ride, but I didn't care. Every mile put more distance between me and the house that had never really felt like home. I expected to feel scared, maybe even second-guess myself, but all I felt was relief. By the time the bus pulled into the station, my aunt was already there waiting for me. She spotted me instantly and pulled me into a hug before I could even say a word. "You did the right thing," she whispered. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that. She helped me carry my bags to her car, asking if I was hungry, if I needed anything. The kindness in her voice was almost overwhelming. I wasn't used to it. When we got to her house, she showed me the guest room and told me to make myself at home. It wasn't big, but it was warm and safe. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the guilt to creep in. But it never did. I didn't miss them. Not my stepmother. Not Jared. Not even my dad. That realization should have hurt. Instead, it just set me free. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and breakfast. My aunt had made pancakes, something my dad used to do when I was little. I hesitated before coming downstairs, unsure of how to act in a house where I wasn't being ignored. But my aunt just smiled and told me to sit. "You don't have to walk on eggshells here," she said. I believed her. The first few days at my aunt's house felt unreal, almost as if I had stepped into a life that wasn't mine. I wasn't used to waking up in a place where I didn't have to brace myself for passive-aggressive remarks or feel like an intruder in my own home. At first, I struggled with the constant quiet kindness that surrounded me, always waiting for the moment when the illusion would break and I would once again be reminded that I was unwanted. But my aunt never treated me like an inconvenience or a problem she had to deal with. She gave me space when I needed it, conversation when I felt like talking, and never once pressured me to explain myself or justify my presence in her home. For the first time in a long while, someone actually asked me what I wanted for my life. She didn't make it seem like my future had already been decided for me, like I had no choice but to accept whatever scraps were left after Jared got everything. She encouraged me to think beyond just surviving, beyond simply enduring whatever life threw at me. It was overwhelming, realizing that I didn't have to settle for whatever was given to me, that I actually had the power to decide where I wanted to go next. Within a week, I managed to find a job at a small cafe nearby. The pay wasn't great, but it was something, and more importantly, it was mine. Every hour I worked, every dollar I earned, felt like another step toward building a future that was actually worth something. I started saving again, not out of desperation to escape, but because, for the first time, I felt like I had something to work toward. Then, my phone started buzzing. At first, I ignored the calls because I already knew who they were from, and I didn't need to hear whatever excuses they had prepared. But when the calls kept coming, I switched my phone to silent, unwilling to even let their voices interrupt the peace I was starting to feel. The text messages, however, were harder to ignore. They started as simple, almost robotic demands, short and cold in a way that made it obvious they weren't reaching out because they missed me, but because they were upset that I had left without permission. My father's messages were brief and impatient, full of orders rather than concern. "Where are you? Come home now. We need to talk." There was nothing in them that acknowledged the fact that I had been miserable under his roof for years, nothing that suggested he wanted to understand why I had left. Then, the guilt-tripping started, and my stepmother's influence became painfully obvious. "Your father is worried sick. He didn't know you were this unhappy. If you had just talked to us instead of running away, we could have worked things out." I could almost hear the sickly sweet tone she would have used if she had been speaking to me in person, that fake, practiced voice she always slipped into whenever she wanted to appear reasonable. I didn't reply, but I kept reading the messages, wondering if maybe, beneath all the manipulation, there was some part of my father that actually did care. It was difficult to untangle the memories of the man he had been before my stepmother came into the picture from the man who had sat back and watched as I was slowly pushed out of my own home. My aunt, who had noticed my sudden shift in mood, asked me if I wanted to talk about it, and after a moment of hesitation, I handed her my phone. She read the messages carefully, her face calm and unreadable, before setting the phone down on the table and meeting my gaze with a look of quiet certainty. "You don't owe them anything," she said, and there was something about the way she said it that made it impossible for me to argue. I nodded, but deep down, I still felt the familiar tug of doubt, the same part of me that had always hoped, despite everything, that my father might one day open his eyes and realize what he had lost. I thought about whether I should at least let him know that I was safe, whether I owed him that much after all the years we had spent together before everything changed. But before I could convince myself to send a message, a new text appeared on my screen. This time, it wasn't from my father. It was from Jared. "Wow, so dramatic. You always wanted to be the victim, lol." That was all it took. I blocked every number without hesitation, knowing there was nothing left for me to say. I wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. Blocking their numbers felt like the final step in closing that chapter of my life. But even after I shut my phone off, a strange emptiness settled inside me. It wasn't regret, and it definitely wasn't longing. But there was something unsettling about knowing that I had finally cut all ties with the people who were supposed to be my family. Even though I knew I had made the right decision, I still found myself wondering if my father had even fought for me at all. Had he tried calling from another number? Had he argued with my stepmother about what happened? Had he even been the one sending those messages? Or had she been writing them while he sat in the background, pretending none of it was happening? I told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't going to waste my energy thinking about people who hadn't thought about me in years. But some wounds take longer to heal than others. Days turned into weeks, and for the first time in my life, I began to understand what it felt like to live without walking on eggshells. My aunt's home was calm in a way I wasn't used to, and it took me a while to adjust to the fact that there was no underlying tension, no unspoken rules about who was allowed to speak and who had to stay quiet. She never made me feel like I had to apologize for existing, never acted like my presence was something to be tolerated rather than welcomed. Slowly, I started feeling more like myself again. I focused on my job, added to my savings, and even started looking at local colleges, knowing that I would have to build my own future without the safety net my father had once promised. Then, one afternoon, my aunt knocked on my bedroom door, a concerned look on her face as she held out an envelope with my name on it. "It came in the mail today," she said. "I think it's from your dad." I stared at it for a long time before finally taking it from her hands. The handwriting on the front was familiar, though messier than I remembered, almost like he had written it in a rush. My aunt didn't push me to open it, just gave me a small nod before leaving the room. For a few minutes, I debated whether I even wanted to read it. But in the end, my curiosity won. I tore the envelope open and unfolded the letter inside, my eyes scanning the words quickly, searching for some kind of explanation, some acknowledgement of everything that had happened. But there was nothing like that. No apology, no regret, just a short, almost robotic message that made my stomach turn. "I hope you got whatever it is you were looking for. You made your choice, so don't expect to come back when things get hard." That was it. No fatherly concern, no attempt to understand, just a final confirmation of what I had already known deep down. I wasn't his child anymore. I folded the letter back up, took a deep breath, and threw it into the trash without another thought. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. After throwing the letter away, I sat on the edge of my bed, waiting to feel something: anger, sadness, maybe even relief. But all I felt was a strange sort of finality. It was over. Any lingering doubts I had about whether my father still cared were gone, erased with a few cold, dismissive sentences. There was no misunderstanding, no room for me to convince myself that maybe, deep down, he had been forced into silence. He had made his choice, and I had made mine. I stayed up late that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything I had left behind. Not the house, not the car, not even the college fund that had probably already been handed over to Jared, but the hope that things could have ever been different. I realized that I had been holding on to that hope for longer than I should have, convincing myself that if I just endured long enough, if I just proved myself enough, my father would eventually step in and choose me. But he never had, and now I knew that he never would. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter. My aunt didn't ask about the letter, and I didn't bring it up. There was nothing to say. Instead, we sat together at breakfast, drinking coffee, talking about normal things, everyday things, the kind of conversation I had never had at home. I hadn't realized how much I had missed this, just existing, without having to justify my presence. Over the next few months, my life slowly started taking shape again. I kept working at the cafe, saving up every extra dollar, and eventually, I applied for a local college. It wasn't the dream school I had once imagined for myself, but it was mine, something I had earned without anyone else's help. For the first time, my future felt like something I could actually control. Jared never reached out again, which didn't surprise me. My stepmother had one. She had gotten rid of me, secured my father's undivided attention for her son, and made sure I was nothing more than a distant memory. And I was fine with that. Let them have their perfect little family. I wanted no part of it. As for my father, he never contacted me again either. No follow-up letters, no more guilt-tripping texts, nothing. It was as if I had never existed to him. And in some ways, maybe that was for the best. I had spent too many years trying to hold on to something that had been slipping through my fingers from the moment my stepmother entered our lives. One day, while cleaning my room, I found an old photo of my dad and me from when I was a kid. It was from a time when things had been simple, when he had still been mine. I stared at it for a long time before finally tucking it into the back of my drawer, not ready to throw it away, but not wanting it in plain sight either. Maybe one day, I'd be able to look at it without bitterness. Maybe one day, it would just be a picture, a reminder of something that once was. But for now, it was just another piece of the past, something I had finally learned to leave behind. And as I stepped out onto the porch that evening, watching the sunset in the quiet comfort of a home where I was actually wanted, I knew one thing for certain. I had lost a father, but I had gained something so much more. I had gained myself.